Hello, students. Welcome. Hoshamdid and Hosh Galdanes. Today I am going to proceed the same discussion on the historical journey of English novel. When we try to trace the origin of the modern novel, it dates back into the very ancient time period. In the very old time period in Egypt, the people were writing the type of prosaic writings that can fall into the category of novel. And those writings were mostly based on the love stories. So, those Egyptian writings, those Egyptian prose works are actually the origin of novel. Those kind of writings were mostly based on love stories. So, from here came a new idea, a new concept that novel was flourished in the Middle Eastern and Islamic world, because in the coming centuries, in the next generation, in the next time period around 10th century, we find another evidence of the such kind of genre. And in the 10th century we find Arabian Nights, and then the 1001 Nights in around 10th century in the Islamic world. Then the stories were translated by the travelers, and they were taken around the world, and including Europe. And and after that, when we trace the origin of English novel, then we can find the traces of novel, or the emergence of novel, in England around 14th century in the form of romances, the medieval time period and the medieval romances. And then the medieval romances were first found in Italy, and they were called novellas over there. And the same kind of novella was written, or was used to be written in England in the form of romances. As I have already told you, are based on the love stories and the very gay settings, and they normally ended happily. So this was the prime feature, or these were the prime features of romances, medieval romances. Boccaccio's Decameron was a very famous literary piece that was based on the collection of stories in the form of episodes. It can be taken as the initial form of novel in Italy. The time period of this book, or this literary work, was around 1350. Then in 14th and 15th century, we find a few writers in Spain in attempt of writing novel. But the only important and survived English literary piece of writing on that time was Don Quixote. Don Quixote was the tale of a very was a sort of a picaresque novel, and the picaresque novel, as I have already told you, is a kind of novel which is based on the rough and irrespectful, or a very vulgar sort of character, but the heroic deeds are of that very character are introduced and discussed in the very novel that is known as picaresque novel. So Don Quixote can be taken as a picaresque novel, but it is very interesting. And I suggest you to go through this very work, Don Quixote. Then comes 16th century in Britain. And in 16th century in the Britain, we find another kind of work that was a prose work, but it was also a kind of novel, and its name was The Gulliver's Travel. Yes, the very Gulliver's Travel we have in our courses of prose in modern academia. So that on that time, Gulliver's Travel was also a kind of novel. And even in today, a few critics consider this work, Gulliver's Travel, although it's a travelogue and it's a prosaic piece, but they consider it an allegorical novel, because that very novel allegorically comments on the situation of Europe on that time. and it was written by Jonathan Swift. So this was the time period of the infancy of novel in England. And in during the same time, we can find other types of romances like Lily's Euphues and Sydney's Arcadia. These are the famous romances, and Sydney's Arcadia is particularly a pastoral romance, having the rustic settings and having some sort of supernatural settings in them, in it. So these were the initial and emerging forms of English novel. Then it reflourished in 17th century at the hands of John Bunyan. And Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress is another very famous work that can be taken as a novel, and it falls into the category of novel, not as a modern novel, but it falls into the category of emerging novel. Pilgrim's Progress was actually on that time an allegorical work, and it can be taken as an allegorical novel. Then comes the later 17th century, in which we find the writings that are based on the adventures and some sort of travelogues, the travelogues that are based on the stories of the voyages, just like Glover's Travel. We have another such kind of work, that is Robinson Crusoe, that was written by Daniel Defoe. Although this was a travelogue and this was based on the adventurous voyages of the central character, but this also falls into the category of novel. Now we can say that from 10th century to 17th century, the novel started as romances. Then it gradually came into the form of the episodic stories. Then it came into the form of prosaic works in the form of travelogues, and then gradually it became the allegorical writing. It became an allegorical writing, like Gulliver's Travel and Pilgrim's Progress, and then as an adventurous writing, as a travelogue like Robinson Crusoe. But these were all the shapes of novel. So that those were the initial phases of English novel. Those were the phases in which English novel was taking its emergence. It was moving towards its actual shape. It was moving towards its modern shape. And after that, we can find in the very century, in the very 17th to 18th century, we find the works of Richardson work Pamela, and then Richardson's work Clarissa, that got popularity on that time as novels, and those were based on the moralistic settings and moralistic bent of the society. And as I have already told you, the central theme of those novels in my previous video, in my previous lecture, because they were dealing with female chastity, and its response came into the 18th century, in the early phase of the 18th century, when Henry Fielding emerged as a novelist, and he wrote a counter narrative that was in the form of Joseph Andrews, and Joseph Andrews was based on the importance of male chastity. Joseph was his central character, just like Pamela, and he was also, we can take this very work of Henry Fielding as the sequel of Richardson's work, Pamela, because Joseph Andrew was introduced as a brother, as a cousin of Pamela in that very novel. Until then, the novel was still emerging in different forms, first as romance, then as a travelogue, then as an allegorical prose work, then as a work that is consisted of the moralistic bent of the society, but the story was there. So yesterday we defined it the extended form of short story. So it was the extension of short story and novella that was gradually taking a new shape. That new shape was novel. Then came 19th century. In the 19th century, or in the later half of the 18th century, we can find some other important names there that were were the people who just brought innovations in the writings of novel, because they introduced themes of common life in the novel. And these names include the names of Sir Walter Scott and Jane Austen. These were the people who just nourished the novel in its current form. However, there are still more things that became the part of the modern novel, but we will discuss it while discussing each of the novelist and the novel individually and separately. For today, that's enough. Thank you so much from my side.